The ZEV mandate is in place in the UK and an end date for the sales of new petrol and diesel cars specified in Europe. These have got a lot of people worried about the future of the petrol and diesel cars they love, but is that worry well founded? I'm not sure it is. Stick with me as I explain why the death of internal combustion does not look quite how you might think. Hello everyone, I'm Andrew. Thanks for joining me on the electric transition. Today I'm going to demonstrate why the death of the internal combustion engine is not quite as pronounced as you might fear, even with the ZEV mandate fully enacted. I had a comment on a previous video decrying the zealots and extremists who want 100% EV adoption. Why, the commenter said, could we not be happy with 50% EV adoption? Wouldn't that be good progress? To which I agreed wholeheartedly. 50% EV uptake would be great progress. But when I asked the commenter, do you think we might reach that? I'm not sure, to be honest, was their reply. Well, that's the point of this video, for us to explore that very question. When might we achieve 50% EV adoption? Before we have a look at the model I've put together to answer that, why not have a guess yourself? The thing about cars is that they last a long time. The average lifespan of a car in the UK at the moment is about 16 to 20 years. That's on average. Some might not last that long, especially if their engines fail, as we have been seeing a bit with wet belt engines, especially if owners skimp on their servicing. However, some last longer than that, especially if owners care for their vehicles, if they cherish them and intend to keep them a long time from the outset. As a result, cars bought now in 2026 can be expected to last beyond 2040. That has an impact on the transition away from internal combustion, if one is to be achieved. When thinking about a transition, there are two sets of figures we might consider. Often we talk about sales, specifically new car sales, the proportion of new cars that are of one drivetrain or another. The other figures we might consider are the proportion of the total fleet that have a particular drivetrain. When considering the benefits to society of such a transition, which one of those do you think are more important? What is the goal we are trying to achieve here, and which set of figures are indicative of successful attainment of that goal? Do new car sales achieve the goal, or does a proportion of the total fleet? I think progress towards the goal is best measured by the proportion of the fleet that have changed. A single year's new car sales is a small drop in the bucket when it comes to emissions, both local air pollution and CO2 emissions. However, I think my commenter's measure was of the new car sales. I think they were more interested in having only half of new car sales being EVs, so that those who want to drive internal combustion can continue to do so. Well, let's look at both. First, let's consider what happens if we cap new car sales at 50% EV uptake. In other words, we weaken the ZEV mandate to make that the manufacturer's target. Here is a model of that scenario. What we're looking at here is the model of total car sales projected into the future. I've assumed that sales don't grow indefinitely, as I think there are some limits to car adoption, such as how much space we have for parking. Therefore, I've assumed that sales grow at about 1% on average until 2035, at which point it starts to stay constant. That might be wrong. It's hard to predict the future, but let's go with it for now. Knowing the total number of new car sales and setting the EV target to top out at 50%, assuming that sales match the target, then we know how many EVs flow into the fleet each year. For anyone not familiar with the numbers, I have two mandate percentages on the left of the tables. The leftmost is the headline figure, what the mandate says, ignoring everything else. From that, I've estimated the real target. The real target the manufacturers have to hit is lower than the headline figure because of the flexibilities that manufacturers are afforded, their ability to offset sales by other means. Next, we need the total fleet size. I've also assumed that that same growth happens to the total fleet as we predicted for new car sales. That seems fairly reasonable. Again, this capping might be invalid, although the numbers don't change as much as you might expect if we tweak that. Let's just go with this as a decent guess, because that's all we can really do. There is some guesswork here. Finally, we need to calculate the number of EVs that will be scrapped. We don't have great data for that yet, as EVs only really started to hit the market in 2011 and only in number after about 2019. As we've already said, cars last a long time, and so the point at which lots of EVs get scrapped hasn't really been reached yet. Therefore, we don't know this for sure. For that reason, I've assumed that scrappage peaks about what petrol and diesel scrappage does, between about 3 and 5% of the fleet per annum. Again, I tried a higher figure here, and it made little difference. What's of interest here is the future, so let's take away the past years, and the figure on the right is what we're really interested in, so let's hide everything else now. Now we can see the proportion of the fleet that is EV by year. What we can see is that we hit 22% adoption by the end of 2034, a third of the fleet by the end of 2040, and just over 40% by 2050. We don't even hit 50% by 2056, 30 years from now. Well, that's a bit of a problem. The point of the transition is to try to dramatically reduce emissions, and this approach is only reducing them by 40% by 2050. That's not enough. Okay, let's look instead at what happens if we follow the ZEV mandate fully, and we go for 100% of new cars being fully electric by 2035. That's what this shows, and now the numbers start to look a bit better. This way we reach 31% by the end of 2034, more like 52% by the end of 2040, and just over 75% by 2050. But think what that means, what those who want to stick with internal combustion still have. At the end of 2034, when the last of the new internal combustion sales have been made, the fleet is still 69% internal combustion. In 2040, it's still at 48% penetration, and in 2056, it's still 15% internal combustion. If you want to continue to drive internal combustion engine cars, you will still be able to. More than 1 in 7 people will be able to continue to do so in 30 years' time. 30 years. Will you even still be driving at that point? Use your current age to calculate when you are likely to stop. Is this really a problem for you? To be fair, we need to consider more than just having the car in your possession. There's more to running a car than just that. So what are the potential downsides to consider? First, we have to bear in mind that fuel stations will fall in number. They won't disappear, of course, but fuel stations are not all that profitable, so they will either need to diversify further or they start to thin out a bit. Secondly, you need availability of parts and servicing to keep the car on the road. That will probably be okay. There will be a number of people in the industry who are as sceptical as you, so I think servicing will be available, and hopefully parts will remain so too. Thirdly, some of the younger members of your family might not thank you for your choices. You are continuing to add to a problem for them by sticking with combustion, but their opinion might not matter to you. Finally, of course, you are missing out on some of the advantages of EVs. If you haven't driven one yet, then they probably aren't obvious, but there are advantages, as those who have switched can attest to. I'll not go into those advantages here, that's not the point of this video, but there are plenty of others on my channel discussing those advantages, which you can watch to get more detail on them. In summary, the death of internal combustion has been highly exaggerated. If you really don't want to drive an EV, then most likely you don't have to. Internal combustion is still around in 30 years' time, even with the ZEV mandate fully enacted. The mandate might look extreme, it might seem too fast, acting over only 11 years, but the effect on the fleet is much slower than that. Cars last a long time, and so the transition away from combustion will be gradual. If you're in your mid to late 50s at the moment, then internal combustion will probably outlast your driving career. Do the maths and you'll see that you probably don't need to fear the transition so much. Having said that, it will be a bit trickier to own them in the future. There will be fewer fuel stations around because there will not be enough business for all of the current ones to remain open. However, there will still be fuel available. And I'd say there will still be parts available and mechanics to maintain them. Other people who don't want to consider the move to new technology either, who don't want to get themselves into a growing market rather than a shrinking one, there always are. Listen, you do not need to approach the transition with fear. Instead, try to approach it with excitement. You get the opportunity to test drive something different, to experience something new, to imagine how life with an EV might be in reality, usually with no cost or commitment. And all the while, you can keep the fossil fuels flowing with the internal combustion engine car you still have at home. Thanks very much for joining me today. Your questions and comments on this subject are most welcome in the comments section. I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do these numbers surprise you, or is this the shape of the transition you envisaged? Does this go some way to allay your fears about the future, to help you see the future more clearly and make you a little less angry as a result, perhaps? Maybe, just maybe, you do still have a choice after all. If you've liked the video, then it's a big help to me if you click the thumbs up button. And I'd love to have you as a subscriber of the channel if you want to see more from me. Thanks.